Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for popping by. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a card using die cuts, but giving those die cuts some extra texture and dimension. These cards really have an awesome wow factor to them. People really love them. So I'm only using two different die sets here. This one here from Sizzix, I really love that you have two choices of poinsettia sizes. And this one here, there's so many different greens in there. I'm using mostly the ones on the left side of the package for this. I'm also using a 3D embossing folder. It's a new one with pine branches. So the first step is to lightly mist both sides of the paper before putting it in the embossing folder. And then I'm going to run it through my Big Shot machine. I run it through a few times just to make sure to get that extra dimension in there. The 3D folders really have a lot of dimension to them, and I find putting it back and forth a few times really helps push that in there. I'm setting that aside to dry, and while that's dry, I'm going to prep my die cuts. You can see from the top of the screen that I have some done already, but I'm going to show you what I have done to each one of them. So the first thing, I have some pine greens here, and I'm taking some forest moss ink with an ink blending brush, and I'm just brushing that ink onto the pines, mainly focusing on the center, starting at the base of the stem and working my way up. I'm not doing the tips. I want to have a little bit of color variation here. I want some light parts and dark parts. So that's why I'm working from the stem. And there's no need to worry about the base of the stem because it's all going to get tucked away. So the next one I'm working on is my berries. I've got a dark brown Copic marker. It doesn't really matter the shade of the brown. You just want to be able to color those stems and cover up the red of the cardstock. You could die cut this out of white cardstock and then color both areas, but I find it easiest just to die cut out of red cardstock and cream and then color these stems. Now I'm using a Copic marker because for the next step or the last step of these berries, I'm going to put some glossy accents on the berries to make them nice and shiny. And by using the Copic markers, that is not going to run. If you use a Tombow marker or something that's dye-based, you really have to worry about or pay attention to where you're putting those glossy accents so you don't get some bleeding with the ink. On the cream berries, I'm taking a Clear Star jelly pen, and I'm just adding a little bit of sparkle to each of the berries, just giving it a bit of a different texture from the red berries. Now I'm putting those glossy accents on there, and it only takes a dot really just to cover those berries and then set them aside to dry. You don't want to touch them while they're drying. When they're completely dry, you get a really nice texture difference between the stem of the berries and those glossy berries, and it also gives it some dimension to it, which I love. And now I'm adding the glossy accents to the cream berries. Now, while these cards have a huge wow factor, there is quite a bit of work in prepping those die cuts. So what I tend to do is put a movie on and just sit and die cut a bunch of different things. These are great uses for scraps. Next, I'm doing the greenery. So I have two different sizes of these evergreen branches or stems, and I'm taking the larger one. I'm dabbing them into some embossing ink, and then I'm putting frosted crystal embossing powder on them. So these have a bit of a different texture to them than regular embossing powder. It kind of has a bit of a grainy texture. I'm not sure if you can see it on the screen there. Next green that I'm going to do is some holly leaves. Now, to prep my cardstock before die cutting, I use Sukwang tape. It's one of my favorite double-sided tapes. You can get it in sheets and you can get it in rolls. If you're just starting out, sheets are a great way to just try it out and see if it's your cup of tea. But if you find you love it, it's more economical to get it by the roll and use it that way in the long run. It is more of an investment initially, but like I said, in the long run, it ends up being cheaper. So I put it on my cardstock, and then I'm taking a X-Acto knife and I'm cutting it down. If you have a piece of cardstock that's smaller and you have little bits left, I like to put them on the side of my tape roll, and I tend to use those little bits up, putting cards together and whatnot, so they don't go to waste. Now, the piece of cardstock that I ended up using today was a little bit wider than my tape, so I'm just trimming those pieces off so that I don't accidentally cut some leaves or holly branches on a spot where I've got some tape and just some cardstock. So to put them in the machine, I like to put my blade side up of my die, the printed side of the tape down, And I typically will run it through a few times just to make sure it's cut really well. We're cutting through the backing of the tape plus the cardstock, so it's a little bit thicker than normal. So you want to make sure that you get a really good cut on it. And it's really easy to see on the back side if it's cut through. If not, turn it a quarter turn or so in your die cutting machine and run it through again, or add a cardstock shim underneath your cutting plate. Every machine's a little bit different, so you'll have to get to know your machine and what it needs. So I have two different shades of green here. I'm going to put the darker one in the center of my holly leaf or holly branch, and then the lighter one on the outside. So I'm taking the backing off of my tape and off of my holly pieces, and I try not to touch them. When you touch the tape, it tends to change the way the glitter sticks to it, and sometimes you get a little bit of a fingerprint impression there. I will be touching the stem of the die cut because, like I said before, that part gets tucked underneath everything, so that part is not seen for any of the branches. So I have a little Slurpee straw there to scoop my glitter and to pour it on my piece. I don't want to just dump the glitter from the bottle, otherwise I wouldn't have any control. For the second color, I am dumping it out of the bottle because I'm just sticking it on to the rest of the tape. Typically, if I'm using a bigger piece with tape on it, I will use some of the tape backing to burnish that glitter in there. It really gets it stuck really well, and it also makes that glitter sparkle. But for those small leaves, I just use my fingers. The last die cut that I'm prepping is the poinsettia, so I'm just taking a dark burgundy ink and I'm just coloring it in the center of the poinsettia. There's not a huge color difference here, but I just like to give it a little bit more dimension by inking it. After that, I'm going to take my fingers and I'm just going to curl the petals just to give them a little bit of movement, a little bit of dimension to them. I just do it with my fingers. There's no tool necessary for this. I'm not trying to get a lot of curl in there. I just want it to not be flat. So before I do anything else, I'm going to take my Distress Collage medium and I'm going to glue the second flower over top of the first one. And you can see how I positioned it. I turned it 180 degrees so that I don't have two of the exactly the same shape on top of each other. I wanted to give it some dimension, and I also didn't want the petals to be right on top of the exact same petal. After I glue it, I take my fingers and I do add some more dimension. And then I'm taking some Nouveau crystal drops in a pale gold, and I'm just adding the center to the flower. And I'm just doing it with little dots, kind of trying to emulate what the center of a poinsettia looks like. Obviously, it's not going to be exact because this is a paper one, but then I'm going to set that aside to dry. Once everything is dry, including the paper that I embossed, I'm going to take that embossed image and I'm just going to lightly ink it with some green ink. Now, a lot of the die cuts that we've created are going to cover this up, but this is just going to give some background texture to the card. If you don't have this folder, you don't necessarily need it. You could always just use a different type of embossing folder or just eliminate it altogether. Your card isn't going to be any less beautiful. I just wanted to use it. I just have gotten it, so I wanted to use it, and I like the background it gives to this piece. So I am making the ink a little bit darker around the edges. There you can see it. I think this folder is so pretty. It has so much potential to it with what you can do with it. So now that that is inked, I'm going to take some Distress Collage medium and I'm going to glue it onto my card base. I like using the Distress Collage medium because if any glue happens to seep out or squeeze out, it dries completely matte and it also dries clear, so you never know that it's there. Now, when you use these 3D embossing folders, sometimes the paper gets a little bit warped. So when I glue it to my card base, what I'm going to do is put an acrylic block on it and then a jar that I have with glass beads, just a little bit of weight to it, just to hold it in place and to make it nice and flat while it's drying. And then you need to wait for it to completely dry. Once it is completely dried, and you can see that it's dried right there, I'm going to start gluing on my die cut pieces. Now this part of the project goes really, really fast because we spent the time to prep our die cuts ahead of time and have them all ready to go. The assembly of the card is actually super fast. I use that same Distress Collage medium and I like that it gives me a little bit of working time while I'm going. You can see as I put this whole thing together, I start tucking things behind each other, and there is still movement with that collage medium. I like that. If that bothers you, you can wait for it to dry between time, or you could say use glue dots. But I like that I can keep moving things around as I am adding them. It just gives me a little bit of flexibility when card making. Now, like I said before, this is the type of card that it has a huge wow factor, but there is a lot to prepping all of the die cut pieces. I taught classes in a couple scrapbook stores for 15 years, and these were the classes that people signed up for. We had a lot of people signing up for them, but it was once they were taking the class, they would be like, oh, I didn't know how much work this was. And that was with me doing a lot of the prep work for them, so that they would prep each one of the die cuts, but I would have some prepped ahead of time just to kind of save on time. So just be prepared. This is a great one. Like I said, put a movie on, prep some die cuts, get everything all ready, and then just kind of enjoy the process. Say do the berries one day, do the holly one day, so it's not all of it all at one time. You can see that I am just layering and tucking things in as they are needed. And here's a reminder that just because you have a whole die cut doesn't mean it needs to stay whole. These berries I cut in half because a lot of it was going to be hidden anyways when I tucked it in. So why not just cut it in half and not need to tuck it in quite as much? So I cut those into two, and in that way, sometimes with different die cuts that it is appropriate for, you can make your die cuts go a little bit further. I tuck these in a few different spots, and in the end, once my card is completely done, I actually tucked in a few more. So my final card that you'll see at the end, I've got a few extra of these berries in there. I tucked some at the top right, and then at the bottom left. I thought it just needed a little bit more brightness there. Now, part of the reason why I have this poinsettia here is it's a nice focal point, but the other purpose of it is it hides that clump of stems in the top left corner. You could even do, say, a bow die cut, or even just a bow made out of ribbon to do the same thing. But it's nice to have a focal point, and it's also nice to hide a bunch of your stems. Now I'm lifting it up here because I thought it was done, and then I realized I forgot my holly pieces, the ones that we had glittered. So we're going to tuck those in there as well. Oh. So I just again put glue at the very end and then tuck these pieces underneath, and you'll see that it kind of just brightens it up. The glitter just adds a lovely texture to this piece, and by layering all these pieces and tucking them underneath, it naturally kind of gives it dimension. So this is the type of card that I don't know if I would really mail it, or if you mailed it, I would maybe use, say, a bubble envelope, something that would give it some cushion and some protection. And I would also be only sending these to the people that I knew would appreciate them, because of all the different work and techniques that go through it. I wouldn't be sending it to someone that I didn't think appreciated handmade cards. So once you've got all of your pieces tucked in there, you're going to let that dry completely. While it's drying, you can do your sentiment. So I just have a Season's Greeting sentiment here, very simple. I didn't think it needed anything complicated. And I'm going to use some embossing ink, and I'm going to gently stamp that onto a piece of cardstock here that matches my poinsettia. And then I'm going to emboss it with gold embossing ink, or sorry, gold embossing powder. And I'm trying to create a little bit of a banner here. So when you use embossing powder, if you haven't used it before you use your embossing tool to melt the powder, you want to take a soft brush and brush off any that have gone in places that you don't want it to be. You could also use an anti-static tool, but in all honesty, I tend to forget that I have it and forget to use it. And that little tiny brush often comes and saves the day if there's powder sticking where I don't want it to. Now I'm trimming my sentiment nice and close, and then I'm also going to create a second piece that's the same width to create a little bit of a banner. Now if you happen to have a die that does a banner, you can use that. I just don't have one. Another option is a stamp that does that, and then you can cut it out or die cut it. Once again, I just don't have one, so I'm just creating one. So after that first piece is trimmed down. I'm just using this is actually a photo corner punch. You could also use a square punch. You could also just use scissors and snip them in. I'm just creating the ends of the little banner. And now I'm taking a scissors and rounding the corners. It's a very, very tiny round. This piece is really, really small, so any of the corner rounders that I have are far too big, so I didn't want to use them. And a scissors works just as well. So I'm taking that, and then I'm going to take my tails of my banner and I'm going to cut them down, and I'm going to round the corners of those as well. And when I say round the corners of them, I mean the parts that would be part of the banner, not the end parts that we just use the punch on. Once those are cut down nicely, we can glue those to the top to complete the banner, and then let that set that aside to dry at the same time as the rest of our card is drying. So you want to make sure that this dries completely before you attach it to the front of your card. Now the die cuts and the colors that I used for this are for a Christmas card, obviously, but you could adjust the flower, you could adjust the greenery, and you could create a beautiful wedding card or use it for a different occasion as well. I just really like using these or creating these for Christmas cards because like I said, they have a huge wow factor to them and they just look beautiful. Christmas cards tend to suit some extra dimension, some extra sparkle, and a little bit of extra. Last thing I'm adding is just a little bit of sparkle around the outside of the poinsettia. It just looked a little bit plain and flat, so I'm just taking some Stickles, which is a glitter glue that has a nice fine tip, and I'm just adding a little bit on spaces around the outside of the flower. I'm not outlining the entire flower. Mostly it's just the petal tips, but once again, it's just to add a little bit of extra sparkle to it. So I don't want to go overboard. Stickles are one of those things that I think a little less is more. I've seen people that have used a ton of Stickles, and to me, it just takes a little bit away from it. But you do you. If you like a lot, then absolutely add a lot. Like I said, I think less is more when it comes to that, but it's super easy to use because it has a nice fine tip to it and you can get it exactly where you want. So for my little banner, now that it's dry, I'm just adding some foam pop dots just to give that a little bit of dimension. You could put it anywhere you want on the front of your card. I'm just putting it towards the bottom right. I just think that space is perfect for it. So there is the finished card at the moment, but in a second you'll see I added the berries, the white berries or the cream berries in the top right and the bottom left, and I think that just finishes it off perfectly. You'll find all of the products that I used to create this card linked down below in the description. Thank you so much for spending some time with me, and I hope you have a fantastic day.